Rocky Flats Oral History Project. I'm interviewing Nat Miullo at the EPA Information Center in Denver. It is the 7th of December 2005. I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and that's it. So, did I pronounce your name right?
Yes, very
Okay.
few people do, so congratulations to
Thank
you.
So Nat, to get started, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background, when you were born, where you were born.
I'm a baby boomer. I was raised in the 50s. I was born in 1957. I grew up in upstate New York. My father is a full-time employee of the United States Air Force. He was involved in research and development as well as national security. So his entire career was spent in the government and Department of Defense. I am a graduate of the New York State Maritime Merchant Marine Academy and moved to Colorado when my family moved out here in about 1975. So I've been here since about 1975. Spent a lot of time living in Colorado Springs and in the Denver area.
And so how did you end up at EPA?
I ended up at EPA in a very odd circumstance. When I was in college, I filled out a recruiter's form for government employment that said, tell us what your areas of interest are. And at that time, I was very interested at being an engineering student in energy and environmental issues. I've always been kind of an environmentalist and a naturalist, and so I thought that perhaps I might be able to learn an awful lot to complement my highly technical engineering education if I were to go into environmental fields. And at the time that I was asked to come to the Environmental Protection Agency, I was working for a design firm in Denver doing heating, ventilating, air conditioning, solar engineering designs. And it was the Reagan administration, and they were gearing up for their brand new hazardous waste uncontrolled sites program. I said, yeah, that interests me, and so I signed on and grew with the agency from 1981 until this date, and never regretted it because it's been an incredibly rewarding experience.
So you started out in this was sort of Superfund stuff, or?
Mostly in the Superfund and Hazardous Waste or Resource Conservation Recovery Act area, monitoring, overseeing, and writing permits and enforcing against hazardous waste facilities.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that is how you ended up working at Rocky Flats, or with Rocky Flats.
It was really a wacky kind of story, but somewhat officious and somewhat spontaneous as to how I ended up working on Rocky Flats. I had had experience as a project manager for the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is a site, a Department of Defense site east of Denver. And my management thought, well, he's had that experience with the Army and the Department of Defense and the state of Colorado. We're starting to get some signals that there's something going on at Rocky Flats and perhaps some jurisdictions that need to be worked out. And so they said, well, let's make the technical contact to Nat Miullo because he's had that experience with the arsenal. It seemed to go well, he understood it, and we'll just throw him into the fray on that issue over with the Department of Energy, see how it works out.
Had EPA had somebody at Rocky Flats before, or was this the first time that someone was involved?
There were no really dedicated resources that EPA had on Rocky Flats. There were a couple of project officers that had gone with the state of Colorado to talk with some of the representatives. I think at the time that I was asked to be the point of contact, there had been 2 site visits, and I remember Don Rash, who was a colleague of mine, he's an engineer also. He now works for the Department of Energy in Idaho National Engineering Lab. He had visited the site once, and he wrote in a very short inspection report, jurisdictionally I think that they are managing waste at the site and not complying with RCRA hazardous waste requirements, and I think they have to. So it was a very short summary, and he recommended that we look into the jurisdictional issues and whether or not the EPA had authority at a site like the Department of Energy site at Rocky Flats.
Now there was some legislation passed at some point in this period that made DoD installations or DOE installations subject to federal laws regarding the environment. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, it was the Superfund law, or CERCLA law.
Mm-hmm.
It's called CERCLA for short.
Right.
It's the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. That's a mouthful, and leave it to the federal government to make things complicated, more complicated than they have to be. Basically, most people know it as the Superfund law, which came into being effect as a result of a site near my old home, Love Canal in upstate New York. And everybody, I think, knows the story associated with Love Canal and the tragedy associated with contamination entering communities, causing what we thought at that time could be cancer clusters, and a tremendous amount of concern and impact and change in this country to assure that communities are safe from inappropriate disposal of hazardous and chemical wastes. And the thing about Rocky Flats that made it intriguing was we were talking about radionuclides and radioactive materials, sometimes mixed with hazardous wastes, as well as jurisdictional issues relevant to the National Securities Act, and whether or not the agency's jurisdiction or the state's jurisdiction reached into facilities that were involved in National Security Act issues.
That wasn't explicit in the original legislation.
Some of the original legislation actually had language that said it was excluded. However, upon analysis, working with the state department, the state's Colorado Department of Health, we found certain nuances in the law that said, actually not everything that they do is excluded. It was the Department of Energy's position and their contractors, more forcefully the contractors' position, that our jurisdiction wasn't there. It was our position, my position in particular, some of our attorneys, and the state of Colorado's position that actually we did have authority and that the National Securities Act did not exclude everything. There were some really interesting words in the regulations and the law, words like source-specific nuclear materials. And one would have to dig down into the definitions of these materials to decide, well, is that wastewater treatment plant or those drum storage areas excluded from regulation because they're part of the National Securities Act or not? Our position was that no, it wasn't. Department of Energy's position was, yeah, actually it's excluded. Then we got into negotiations about, well, guys, let's not fight. Let's do the right thing. And that's when the Department of Energy and the contractor said, we're good at this. We're scientifically intelligent. We know how to manage facilities. We are probably the most knowledgeable representatives in the world about how to deal with difficult materials. We're going to do the right thing. And that's when they started talking to us about compliance with the spirit of the requirements, as opposed to admitting that the jurisdiction and the legal enforcement authorities were real.
When was this?
I would say around 1986 through 1989 was when we had the major debates of jurisdiction, where a lot of time and money and effort was spent on legal battling, and the technical staff said, we need to do the right thing anyway. So while you guys are off figuring out who has authority and jurisdiction, we're going to start changing the processes in the systems at the plant. And the first part of that was learning what actually went on at the plant. And amazingly so, I think that I was the very first federal inspector outside of the Department of Defense and Department of Energy complex and community that was authorized to do inspections on the site. I think that they had jurisdiction for their own OSHA health and safety issues. They had jurisdiction for their own compliance with Atomic Energy Act requirements. They had jurisdiction for their own international atomic health and safety standards issues. And there was very, very few, if any, people going into Department of Energy complexes nationwide. And I think I and another EPA inspector at the Ohio facility near Fernald were the first people to ever be allowed inside the doors. So it was a very unique experience.
Did you have to get a Q clearance?
I did, eventually, in order to be able to see some of the areas. That was an experience, too.
Yeah, I bet.
I had never intended to do anything like that. I knew a lot about what that required because my father had done that for his career for years and years and years. I finally did get that Q security clearance. Oddly and interestingly enough, that didn't matter sometimes. There was still a need-to-know basis under the National Security Act. So one of the most oddest things that I would be involved in is, even with a high-level Q security clearance, I would be escorted throughout the facility while I was doing my inspections. And the FBI and the EPA's Criminal Investigations Group got a big kick out of this. In my inspection reports, I would document that they would escort me through areas that I needed to see some information, but they would determine whether or not I would be allowed to see it. And sometimes those areas were juxtaposed next to each other, and I was required to wear a blindfold. So imagine, here I am doing this independent inspection. I'm supposed to be the person who helps the state and the community understand whether they're in compliance with things. And to do that, I have to visually make observations, but I was being escorted through the facility with a blindfold on. I don't think that went over very well with some of the other independent people that came along later on, such as the FBI or EPA's Criminal Investigations Unit.
So they would put a blindfold on you when you went from one place to the next because there's something in between they didn't want you to see, or they didn't?
Yes, and there are also some things that they thought, well, we think you need to see this, but it's also a national security issue, such as a drum with a tool in it that was contaminated and being stored there forever.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really the waste that was national security concern. It was the shape of the tool, or the fact that the tool existed, or how many of them there were. None of the people at the plant wanted to place themselves or myself in a position where they were violating a National Security Act requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would err on the side of being more cautious than not, until at some point someone higher up in the security community could make a determination that, well, it's really not nationally significant national security information. Yeah, you can let Nat Miullo see this stuff. But then there were other nuances. What would I write in my inspection report? What would I actually portray? When my reports become part of the public record, what would be compromised under the National Security Act? It was very, very serious stuff, although sometimes I must admit it was hard to take seriously. I would end up having to draw little diagrams instead of taking photographs because I wasn't authorized to take a photograph. But I felt like in order to show things like how concrete blocks were deforming or not hardening, I couldn't take a picture of it because it was national security. But I had to describe how the form had degraded and possibly eroded and gotten into the environment through water seepage off of the 903 pad or from a tent where they were being stored. And so the only way I was able to do that was to draw pictures in my inspection reports. People used to get a kick out of that because they'd be smiling. Some people felt like it was intentionally blocking me from doing my work and making it harder and harder and harder to be able to discover information on how waste management practices were going on at the plant. Other people felt, it really is just this conflict of national security versus complying with environmental laws. Hasn't been worked out, hasn't been really understood. Over time, what we would find is that more and more information would be revealed. It was appropriate to share this information. And I think that's a very important issue. I think looking back, what we'll see is that history repeats itself. That the more that we keep private under the auspices of national security, the more we realize that we're not taking holistic approaches to either financial or health and safety management issues. And that's a mistake that we make over and over again. And we're making it now, at the time that this interview is taking place. A lot of the things that your questions prompted in my thinking made me think, well, we're right back at that place in a different venue right now with our concerns about anti-terrorism and national security and homeland security in this country right now. The same mistakes we made back then in not sharing information across disciplines, across scientific job functions, across agencies is being experienced again in this country now. And it would almost be humorous if it wasn't so consequential and cost money and just freedoms of our democracy.
So where did you come down on this? You said some people thought that they were intentionally making your job difficult, and some people thought that was just the conflict between national security and your job. Did you feel that they were helpful and that they wanted you to find this stuff?
I think that to answer that question, it depends on how you answer it. If you're talking about it on an individual basis, person to person, the people who worked at the plant at Rocky Flats, whether a Department of Energy employee, a Department of Defense employee, or a contractor, were incredibly conscientious people. They worked very hard, they were very competent and skilled. They wanted to do the right things. I think that it was really a comedy of errors, of too many layers of bureaucracies, requirements, constraints, that made it almost impossible for someone of a normal, let alone a higher level competency, to function and meet all of the requirements. It just was too complicated and too layered. Once the doors were open, and what was really odd is that I found myself, and some of the state inspectors found themselves, in a position of knowing more about the operations of the plant than the actual people who worked there. Because under a national security scenario, there's a concept called compartmentalization, and it's very intentional, and it's a cornerstone of national security. One building is not supposed to know the processes or the doings of another building, so someone right next door to another person won't even know the waste streams coming into them from that process. Well, as I started to get a bigger picture view from our waste characterization efforts over a couple of years, it turned out I was the person who was knowing more about the holistic management of the plant than some of the people there. And because they were so compartmentalized and looked at things only in little bits and boxes, they couldn't see the efficiencies that they could gain from managing in a different way. So I don't think there was a lot of intentional prevention of me trying to get into the plant. Now, I think if you were to speak to an FBI agent or someone who was a prosecutor, you'd get a different opinion. I think they believed that the Department of Energy and the contractors were intentionally stonewalling people like myself, preventing information from getting out, worried about their liability, their culpability, and the financial impact on penalties, and therefore trying to buy time. I don't agree with that. I think that it was really just a matter of people trying to do the best they could with what they had, wanting to conscientiously do the right things, but having too many layers of constraints placed upon them. I think that we could have gone faster in solving those problems if a lot more common sense was just applied and people just did what made sense and didn't worry about all of the potential problems that they'd be creating by sharing information, doing different processes. And I think that's a great lesson to learn from that era and that intense era of Cold War technology buildup, because it was just such a rapid technological advance that was experienced anywhere in the world right here during those years of détente and Cold War buildup.
Could you describe, when you went on your inspections, did people say to you, oh, there's something here you should look at, or were you just sort of poking around trying to figure out what they were doing with their waste, or what was your mandate and how are you able to do it? There
were and are some very official, some very officious, and very required processes and steps that I would have to go through. But as time went on, I started to begin getting frustrated about not really knowing all of the answers about where all the waste was, how it was managed and processed, how much of it was there, what was the safety level. So after I got my Q security clearance, it was like doors opening up, and I started to independently move about the facility and actually go into areas I probably was not authorized to go into.
Still with an escort?
Not with an escort.
Okay.
There were times where I actually had enough identification and authorization where I could go freely about into areas that I probably actually didn't even have clearance to go into.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that incredibly liberating, because I felt finally I was able to do my job unfettered and uninterfered with. I found that once that started to occur, in common areas like cafeterias or libraries, people would come to me and start informing me of issues and things that they would not feel comfortable were being raised through their management or their supervisory levels. Some of that information was bogus. Some of it was a practical joke. Some of it was just games that got played. There's like a green blob oozing down through the bowels of building 801. It's on floor 6D, secret clearance required. No such place ever existed, so it was a practical joke. Other people were incredibly conscientious and very concerned and worried. The Pond Creek concrete issue was a concern. People who were contractors and just getting the jobs were coming to me and saying, I don't think this is working, and we're being pushed to move too fast to process this. We're not following our quality assurance, quality control requirements. That prompted me to be concerned, and then I got a call from the facility management themselves, who had gotten now into a routine of contacting us in the state and informing us when problems started to exist. That never happened before. They always handled it internally. They never released information to the outside unless it was a catastrophic event, and they had very few of those. Fortunately for us and the metropolitan area, with such a very complex and very hazardous mixture of materials being handled there, very little events occurred to really impact the human health and the environment. And we were very fortunate. It could have been different. We've all learned about Bhopal and Chernobyl, and things could have happened there. So that's a testimony to how careful and conscientious that workforce was. They really were very conscientious. And the thing that they used to always tell me is, remember Nat. And the thing they would always tell the protesters is, remember Nat, we live next door too. Our family and our kids are either downwind or downstream, and we want to do it right. So I would get some people coming to me and reporting directly because they were concerned I wasn't getting the message. Sometimes that panned out, and we found things that we needed to fix. Other times it was of no consequences. We already knew about it, or it was actually not happening.
So how would you characterize the general state in which you found their waste management practices and processes?
I think that the general state was very good. Most of the materials that they handled were contained inside the facility and the plant. Some of their paperwork criteria, requirements, and procedures were abysmal. They weren't following the regulatory requirements. They weren't tracking and managing their waste, because like almost any industry that I used to inspect, and there were hundreds of different sectors that I did over the 15 years I was in that program, they were producing something. Their job was to produce the triggers that went into nuclear warheads. They were a production facility. They weren't an environmental facility. So they paid a lot less attention to their waste stream than their production. And this was very common with any industry at that time frame, between late 70s up until the 90s, when pollution prevention, environmental stewardship became a much more popular and economic focus for this country. So they were probably at the higher end of waste management practices than most of the other industries that I visited, like the refining industry or electroplating industries. That was refreshing and that was reassuring, yet there were still a lot of problems. This compartmentalization and not having a holistic approach to how they handled their waste streams was an incredibly important discovery, an incredibly important change that they would have to go through in order to change their priorities, change their focus, and add on to what they had done. Finding ways to recover waste streams was a big challenge, and they worked very hard at that. Some of them, their waste streams, they would never be able to recover. Things contaminated with plutonium or uranium are just not things that you recycle. And so finding disposal options was a big, big issue. Spent a lot of time and a lot of money working with the people at Rocky Flats to find out how to do that. involved a lot of options, shipping things to Idaho, shipping things to waste isolation pilot plant, shipping things to Nevada, stabilizing them so they can be safely transported across highways and state boundaries. And of course all of that requiring intensive processes and communication with the communities that these materials would go through. Sometimes that was done well, and sometimes it wasn't. We were learning as we went. And the Rocky Flats experience taught us some of the fundamental lessons we now know about risk communication, community involvement, communication with the community. We made some big mistakes. We learned some things. We implemented some innovations that never happened anywhere else. It really was an evolution on how to handle these processes in an open discourse, in an open dialogue with several stakeholders. That is what was very unique about Rocky Flats. The stakeholder process was put into place, very much so because of the insistence of Governor Roy Romer, who was not very pleased to learn that a facility run by the federal government in his state was subject to a criminal investigation. He was not very pleased to be surprised by that information.
So these processes of learning how to dispose of the waste, what were they doing? And at what point did they switch their thinking about this, or start thinking about what they were going to do with it? And what were they doing beforehand? Was there a mental shift that you had to deal with your waste that wasn't there before, and were you part of that?
I think I can safely say that I was a part of the mental shift that went on at Rocky Flats and how to handle their waste products, because it was not something that they were focused on. They didn't put their resources to. They didn't put their highest and most best practiced and skilled people on. I think that the shift occurred gradually, though, because there was still a cultural aspect within the Department of Energy that had to be reached. First of all, reached. And EPA and the state by no means were the experts in figuring out how do you most effectively reach that culture where, well, production's number one. Our mission is keeping the free world safe from the terrors of communism or anyone else that could hurt the United States. Waste management, that's not our primary mission, and it's kind of a secondary thing. So there's this culture that you had to reach. And on the worst end of that spectrum was perhaps the individual or the collective group that would say, well, these environmental tree huggers that want us to handle environmental problems are actually national security threats themselves. They want to tear down the fiber of America. You would get some of that feeling and sense and pressure. Not so much during the time that I was involved in it. If the same thing were happening today and we still relied on massive weapons of destruction for deterrent, we probably wouldn't be moving as quickly as we did in that time frame, where the Cold War was dismantling. The Russian threat was falling apart before our very eyes. It wasn't Nat Miullo or the State Health Department or the protesters or the activists who changed the mind of the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. It was the crumbling of the Soviet Union. It all happened at the same time. So there was a cultural aspect that had to be changed. There was a reality factor in history associated with the Cold War where it was coming to an end. And the fact was being revealed that our nemesis wasn't all that technically competent to begin with. Was that threat real? And I think that's one of the greatest lessons of Rocky Flats and its part in the Cold War. All this secrecy, all this money spent on something that a lot of people now would judge wasn't actually as big a threat as we were brought up to believe was a threat. Therein lies the lesson. Some of the lessons are always question authority, and in this country we're supposed to be allowed to do that. And I think approaching that culture over the years that we did was one of those things that did occur. And that's not to place blame anywhere. It really is just an observation of how things happen and how entrenched the culture was. It took a number of years to really shift thinking, to place the priorities, to put the resources on the environmental management issue. And it was a learning experience for the whole country at that time.
Do you think, so you're saying the emphasis on, they could afford to to think about their waste because they didn't have to, because suddenly the emphasis on production wasn't as important because the Soviet Union was crumbling. I mean, if we were doing it all over again now and we had the Soviet Union building all these, or China, or whoever is going to be next building all these weapons, and we decide we have to keep up, would you think all the environmental stuff would go by the wayside again?
You know, I don't think it would. It's a very interesting question. It's a great historical and sociological question upon which I bet a lot of good research could be done. I don't think that the conditions are the same. I do think that people are incredibly aware of environmental concerns and that you still would have some element addressing it. However, there is something called Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. I don't know if you're very familiar with it, but it talks about basic human needs and security and shelter and food being those basic needs. And as you move up that hierarchy, we start getting into the more intellectual pursuits and more sustainability aspects of our society and our communities. I think when people are in fear, when there are threats, when there are outside influences that say, hey, we've got to hunker down, there's less for this, and we live in a world of limitations and not endless opportunities, then we get back down to that basic foundation of the Maslow hierarchy of survival, shelter, food, and we forget some of the more long-term, holistic, and sustainable aspects that we've really come to find are the things that are more important. So I think that we have shifted back simply because of our financial strains in this country now. The environmental aspects, concepts of sustainability over the long term have taken a back seat today. They would again if the escalation were to occur even more. And so I think it wouldn't go away. The knowledge is still there. There are fantastic and fascinating people like William McDonough out there writing books called Cradle to Cradle that are keeping our attention on the fact that, hey, we need to develop sustainable resources and energy sources. We need to get off of oil. We need to get out of the nuclear realm. In this country now, because of our energy discussions, we're starting to talk about going back to nuclear energy. And we haven't solved those long-term cumulative environmental problems on what to do with the waste. We can probably move more to localized, smaller kinds of nuclear energy development because communities can take these issues on themselves and decide for themselves, do we want to do that? But I think the pressures and the financial pressures and the sociological pressures push us backwards, but they don't push us all the way back to where we were in the 50s and the 70s when the issues with environmental protection first came to light at Rocky Flats or any of the other Department of Energy laboratory complexes.
So you had said that you know when you were brought on board at Rocky Flats, there had been some concerns. People started thinking about the waste management stuff. Were there specific incidents that propelled EPA to start looking into this?
Well, there were several incidents that we noticed were problems. A lot of them had to do with mixed hazardous waste like solvents being co-disposed with radioactive waste, mixed and co-disposed. The primary first indicator was something that came to our attention through the Colorado Department of Health. And there was a person who was involved in that who was a technical person who is now, I think, the director of their enforcement program. His name is Dr. Fred Dowsett. He came to EPA with the revelation that, guys, the groundwater is contaminated. And sure enough, you know, you look at the data, and one of the indicators was that the groundwater parameters were at higher concentrations than what the standards would allow. And that got us looking at solar evaporation ponds management and whether they were leaking. And that was the first indicator. It was a direct environmental effect, something that could leach into groundwater or maybe even surface into Woman Creek or Coal Creek. So you have a direct environmental concern. That just was a domino effect. It led us to question solid waste management practices, air emissions practices. Once that door was open and we found evidence of contamination, we just started looking at everything. How well do they know their waste streams? How well do they characterize them? Do they analyze for them? They're so busy on the production end, what's going out the back door isn't necessarily well understood. And as time went on, as environmental assessments under the Superfund and the hazardous waste program went on, we found more and more practices that were very, very common during those times, like disposal of hazardous materials in solid waste landfills that shouldn't be there, and then billions of dollars of cleanup. So here we are now, moving towards cleanup. Back then, it was just figuring out what are the problems.
So what did you know about Rocky Flats before you got involved with the...
I didn't know anything. I didn't even know that the nuclear weapons manufacturing process was what it was. I knew nothing about how specialized the facilities were all around the country. I knew nothing about that plant. I used to drive by it to go hiking, and I thought it was a prison. It looked like a prison to me. I don't know that the workers would appreciate that, but because of its security complex structure, it kind of looked that way to me. So I knew nothing about it until I read the first inspection report and got some background documents on it. And back then, gosh, it's going to show how old I am. Back then, we didn't have the internet. I couldn't Google it. So I would have to try to find written materials, library materials, and it was very difficult at that time to do that because it was a national security facility and there was very little in the public domain about its function, and the people who worked there could speak very little about it. So probably their families and they were the only resources. So I didn't know very much about it at all when I first was introduced to the assignment.
And what was your impression the first time you went on site? It sounds like you had been on site in other industrial facilities and DoD facilities. Was it similar to those? Was it very different?
In many aspects, I saw very similar things. Some of the older buildings, the wastewater treatment plants that were built in the 50s, were already showing signs of degradation and older technology that wasn't exactly up to date. Things specifically like no secondary containment on tanks holding hazardous materials. In other areas where they were managing the product or managing some of the higher end isotopes, it was incredibly advanced, way more advanced than anything I had seen in other industry sectors, and very, very well maintained, high level of safety applied it. So it was a mixed bag. It just depended on which end of the manufacturing process you were in. As you got more and more removed from where the production was and phased down from where the main mission was focused, the industrial processes, the resources, the financial resources were diminished, and so therefore the infrastructure was lessened. And so that had to be changed. There was a definite shift over the years from the 80s until now to manage those.
So what were the buildings like?
So the older buildings in 771 were very much like any industrial complex. Some of them seemed to be a little in need of repair, in wear and tear. Again, like any complex small municipality, and that's what the Rocky Flats plant was. It was basically a small town. There were programs that got priority attention and more resources, and there were programs that did not. So for the most part, it was pretty safe, very sound, and in some places there was sign of deterioration, concerns, and problems.
Architecturally, how would you describe them in terms
Kind of gray. The word gray comes to mind. There's a lot of gray. Very industrial, and certainly not the kind of environment that Upton Sinclair described in his famous work, but more like a boiler plant. If people have ever visited a boiler plant, that's what I would call it. And actually the workstations were much smaller and focused. The job functions there were very very precise. Until I got my clearance, security clearance, I didn't get to go into some of them. There were an area that was incredibly fascinating to me as an engineer were the micro lathes, where they did such fine lathing processes of how they shaped the triggers that they were all controlled by computers and robots, and the cuttings and the shapings were so fine that the technology was very advanced for that time. Those areas were almost pristine and very, very maintained very, very well. Mm-hmm. In other places, it was just a wastewater treatment plant, and you've seen hundreds of those before. These were in pretty good shape, a little older than some, in need of repair, and the pipelines needed to be traced to find out where the heck that stuff was going so it could be managed and tested and monitored for environmental contaminants better. And so there were improvements that needed to be made. On the whole, it was actually a pretty safe place to work, is what my impression was, because people were very aware, they were very well trained. And if they weren't, then it was probably indicative of an area where they weren't getting the resources that they needed. They weren't getting the attention, the priority focus that they needed. There wasn't the higher educated workforce in that area. And so that was a very unfortunate thing, because I think that the workers who came to me and their families who came to me with complaints about exposures, there were several cases that were legitimate, and that it didn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes there was personal responsibility involved in that, and other times there was the responsibility of the contractors and the federal government and the complex to have provided more information and more safety for those workers. Hindsight and armchair quarterbacking is always easier than having to be the person that implements it, but I do think that there were problems that should not have happened out there.
Any specific ones that come to mind?
I don't really have a specific one that comes to mind. I do know of the stories that, I guess in government we call them whistleblowers now. I'm more partial to the term that that Serpico from the New York City Police Department uses. He uses lamplighters instead of whistleblowers. It's a much more positive connotation to that kind of person. Mm-hmm. And I remember Jim Stone, who worked in the plant, and he would come forward with some of these stories, and of course he was on the inside, so and it seemed as if he was coming forward for altruistic reasons, and so there was a tendency to want to really believe what he had to share with us. And of course, every story, no matter who it is, needs to be validated and verified, and the facility needs a chance to respond, and investigations need to happen. But the stories that I heard about workers falling asleep near pipelines where radioactive materials was transported and then getting brain tumors just were incredibly disturbing. In my own case, I got a notification from the health and safety facility at Rocky Flats because EPA didn't have the capacity or the money to pay for my own radioactive medical monitoring, and they said that they had picked up, they needed to have me come in to do a medical monitoring. They said that their first scanning had picked up a significant plutonium spike in my lung. So I had to go through several other tests. Those tests subsequently proved to be not statistically significant to indicate a level of contaminant. But I still have that piece of paper that says, your exposure level is this. We think this amount may have been somehow inhaled or ingested while you were on site. And I thought, well, that's kind of freaky. That's scary. But I'm not going to worry too much about it, because think about the people who work there and the potential for their exposure every day. Just making one mistake in your personal protective equipment could expose you to something that was just not very healthy for the human biological systems. So human health was a real issue, and when you hear those stories, you have to take them seriously, because it really is a very important aspect of learning for the future. And if we ever get back into nuclear energy production, not losing those lessons learned, because we don't want to have those tragedies continue. I think one of the biggest tragedies for the people who work there or their families is not knowing. And there's no excuse for that. Our science and our capabilities are so advanced now that there really is no excuse for not being informative, for not shedding light, for not sharing information and opening the door. It's really been proven time and again, and I don't care what venue you're in, whether it's Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant or Libby, Montana and asbestos, or the tobacco industry. We have learned this lesson over and over again, and I think that's really one of the greatest lessons that Rocky Flats can teach us, is that we just need to be more open with the information that we have and the knowledge that we can share. It really works out better that way.
So did you, when you were on site, I mean, did you feel safe?
I did. I felt very safe. There were a couple of incidences where I was very concerned. I went into a laboratory. I forget the series of the name of the building. I keep thinking it was 551. It was an experimental laboratory where they did nuclear weapons experiments, and there was a monitor that was triggered. And an alarm went off, and I did not have a respirator on, and one of the contractors that was with me, his eyes got very big, but that was just his character and his nature. And so I thought to myself, well, did I get an exposure? Was there an incident? And I actually believe that incident was the one incident that led to me having to come in and doing medical monitoring. There was another time when I was finally let into one of the areas that they called their vaults, where they stored a lot of their nuclear and mixed waste materials. And I had to wear a lead vest. And I had, I'm very well studied on the health and safety factors. I know how many doses per year are considered under the international and national standards for an acceptable amount of exposure. And even though I wore a lead vest into the facility, I said to myself, I'm just wondering, how safe is this, and what am I doing here? But it really was of no real long-term consequence to my personal health, and for the most part, 90% of the time, I felt very safe just about moving anywhere in the facility.
Let's see. I guess did you have any frustrations with the legal limitations of your work at Rocky Flats?
I, in particular, became very frustrated with the legal aspects of the debate of jurisdiction between the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the state of Colorado. I felt we spent way too much time debating that issue. Where it would manifest itself, where the rubber would hit the road, is in our cleanup agreements. There were several generations of cleanup agreements. They would be made, they would be implemented, and years down the road, 2, 3, sometimes 5 years down the road, they would have to be renegotiated. And every time that we got back to the table to update these cleanup agreements, there would be this debate about jurisdiction, about whether the Department of Energy and their contractors were even subject to environmental regulations, whether the state or EPA should even be granted access to certain areas, or whether it was even our concern. A lot of precious time was wasted in those kinds of discussions. It's not just who can inflate their chest the most as to what authorities we have. It's not some contest as to who's tougher or more important. This is the same federal government, and the community just wants to know that we're being protective of their communities, their children, the people who work at the plant, and of the environment. So we probably could have been a lot more effective, wasted less time, spent less money than we did in the early stages. Now, towards construction completion, the cleanup is coming under budget and earlier than anticipated, and that's where we needed to be 10 years ago. And I think the legal jurisdictional debates didn't really serve this country or the people of this country very well. Now, some of my esteemed colleagues that I met who are legal representatives for the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense would agree vociferously with me on that point. And I think therein lies the problem. You have two opinions on what is the best thing for the country. In my opinion, that debate wasted precious time in the cleanup of the environmental problems at the site.
You said every time you're renegotiating these cleanup agreements, is it the same people debating, or did you have to deal with a whole new cast of characters?
At times it was the same people, and at times there was a turnover of new people, and part of that was that issue. You had to rebuild those relationships, rebuild that trust, and cover old ground. We covered this stuff back in 1981 when we signed the first agreement. You guys decided you're going to comply with the spirit of the law. Well, we're going to define what that spirit is for you, because that's our oversight role. Later on, it would get down to other issues, but the same legal questions of jurisdiction and which statute trumped which statute came into play. Was the National Security Act more important than environmental regulations? Depending on where you sit, you have a different opinion. And so new people, same arguments, waste a lot of time.
Personally, you must have been pretty young at this point.
Yeah, young and stupid is what I remember.
I mean, how old were you when you started getting involved with Rocky Flats?
I think I was between 30 and 35 years old.
Would people, I mean, did you feel that people gave you enough deference in your role?
That gets to another question, and I wanted to share that with you. One of the questions you forwarded to me was, what was my first meeting like? I went to my first meeting in one of the offices of the building. I was not in a secure area. There were about 12 people in the conference room. It was only me from the EPA. Nobody from the Colorado Department of Health in that first meeting was attending. Well, maybe one person from the Colorado Department of Health was attending. And it was DOE employees and contractors. They were all in suits or professional dress clothing. I wore blue jeans, clogs, and a flannel shirt, and my hair was, I think, over my ears. So I'm not sure they really took me too seriously. I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be a lot of fun. Because at that point in time, I felt that it was very important to be able to make inroads into a community and a culture that had not been exposed to the kinds of things that I had learned over the previous 6 or 7 years implementing those programs in different industrial sectors. I had been through this before. I had been into oil refineries. I had been into chemical manufacturing plants. I had been into repair garages. I had been into electroplating plants that had never seen an EPA inspector, had never even thought about the environmental consequences of their manufacturing processes. This was the same thing, just on a grander scale. And I was very excited. It was a challenge. It soon became very overwhelming. And I became actually very, very fearful because of the potential political ramifications of what was happening. It was at that time that I began to develop a very close working relationship with a newspaper reporter, so that I felt I had at least some kind of safety valve. If things got very pressured on me, if I was pressured not to pursue my job through the agency because of either legitimate national security concerns or political pressures, then I had at least some avenue. It turns out I really didn't need that avenue. There was some hesitation in our own agency to pursue a full enforcement venue, but that was pretty consistent at that time with other federal agencies. Sister, brother agencies were treated differently under the law and in sort of an attitude. I'm not saying that that's right. I am saying that that's the way it was.
So it was a little more hands-off.
It was a little more hands-off.
So
a little more of a cooperative atmosphere.
Right. Were you fearful for your job that you would somehow, that you would somehow be prosecuted for national security?
I had that a healthy respect for that, both because of my father being in that industry and actually believing in a lot of what national security requirements are. But I was also fearful simply because simply because it was not necessarily a common thing that was going on. There weren't people walking into Department of Energy nuclear weapons facilities all over the country and exposing the fact that the environmental practices were not up to snuff. Rocky Flats and Fernald were two of the first, and they were happening at the same time. They were occurring simultaneously, and what was going on there wasn't being revealed openly. And whenever you do something like that, you kind of get a little paranoid. I mean, after all, we all saw the movies with Jane Fonda and Jack Lemmon, and the pressures that can be brought. There is a lot at stake, a lot of financial issues at stake.
Mm-hmm.
Penalties were very severe as a result of the outcome of the criminal investigation. And we are a capitalistic society, and so things can happen. And you put yourself, your own family, in a high visibility, high risk scenario. It's wise to sit back and think about that and be cautious. And so I was bold, I was young, and I was reckless, but I was also cautious.
Did you fear for your personal safety?
I never really did. I never did. I feared for my privacy. I felt that both the security clearance and any kind of monitoring that might be going on as a result of checking into my credentials was an invasion of my personal privacy. But I went forward with that, and I lived with it.
Did you ever feel invaded? Did they ever overstep the line?
Specifically, I remember living in Lafayette, Colorado, and my neighbor across the street worked for Rockwell International, and he was interviewed during my security clearance, and it was a very routine process, but he made some kind of joking remark about my partying habits and how he revealed them, and so that was an invasion of privacy. I kind of felt at one point in time during the criminal investigation that my phones were tapped, and I had no idea who was doing that, whether it was us or the FBI or the Department of Energy or the National Security Agencies or who it was. And I didn't like that idea very much.
Did you hear things? Or
I heard clickings on the phone. There's no way that I could ever really validate or verify that because I don't have access to that kind of information, and I don't even have the desire to know. But it gave me pause for thought. It made me think, what's happening here? And that's why I kept meticulous records and made sure that I had relationships with people who I was communicating with, and some of whom did not want to hear those stories about what was going on. They would much rather prefer that I handle it and that I refer information to others, but they didn't really want to get involved.
You supervisor type people?
Yeah, people in my management chain and that kind of thing. Because it's an incredibly daunting and high level of responsibility, high level of political visibility, and your run-of-the-mill, I hate to be stereotypical here, but to put forward a gross generalization, your run-of-the-mill federal employee is there because of the stability of the position and the ability to provide for their family in a relatively stable environment. They're not necessarily there to churn up things or rock the boat. And at that time, this issue did that. And also, it was I didn't have any hesitation in discussing issues with the media, which was a problem for the agency. Mm-hmm. I had an interview with Tom Brokaw. That was a nationally televised event, and that is always something that the agency, any agency, is very careful about. They want to make sure the message is done professionally, that it's accurate, and that the right person is giving that message. And so that can cause a lot of consternation, both preparing for the event and wondering, well, should we do this or not? So I didn't always feel like I had full support because sometimes there wasn't full support.
Did you, in doing your interview with Brokaw and your other media contacts that you discussed, did you have to get permission to do that, or is that something you just did of your own initiative? And
I always had to get permission to speak with someone in the media. I didn't always do that, and that's how I got educated on the fact that I needed to get permission. There were, I think, some preceding articles in the New York Times that caused a great deal of concern. with the agency leadership. Not that they wanted me to stop having those discussions, but they wanted me to follow the appropriate protocol, informing them ahead of time, making sure we did the practicing, figuring out what the message was.
Sorry, we're right. Tape B of my interview with Nat Miullo. It's the 7th of December, 2005. I'm Hannah Nordhaus. We're here at the EPA Information Center in Denver. And Nat, we were just discussing your contacts with the media. And you were saying you had just mentioned a series of New York Times articles that came out. This was preceding the raid, or?
Yes, these preceded the raid. These were more along the... Well, actually, no, I have to say that maybe one of them preceded the raid. If my recollection is correct, one of them may have. And then as the raid went forward, of course, there was much more interest in the story, and all of the leads and resources were being cultivated more by the news media. So I think there were a couple after that, and that I think, rightly so, gave a lot of concern to agency representatives, because at that point I was kind of freelancing, and they needed to sort of get some structure, get some rein on this whole thing, and making sure that things weren't being taken out of context, that my statements were actually verifiable and backed up. But mostly it was really a preference not to do business through the media and with the media in that kind of a process, to do it in a different way, where there was a lot more coordination with the stakeholders. And that really wouldn't come about for another year or so as the governor's commission on Rocky Flats got formed, and there were more frequent community meetings on the process. Actually, that was already going on, and the governor was having a meeting, because I remember being at a really huge meeting when the day that the raid happened, and speaking with his aide, and realizing, to my surprise, that the aide had no idea that that something was going to occur. And I, in my own naivete, thought, well, of course the governor of the state must know about the raid taking place that day, because how could they coordinate such an intense activity and make sure nothing unsuspected happened, such as a confrontation between perhaps an eager FBI agent and a security guard at the plant? That kind of thing could have been really dangerous. And so I just assumed that there was coordination going on, and it was a revelation to me to know that, or at least hear publicly, that the governor's office didn't know anything about it, because at that point I had been made aware of it by the agents investigating the case, because my inspection reports were the basis of a lot of the affidavits for the search warrants. So they were questioning me before they went in. And I was very surprised to know that many people did not know about it. I thought that I just didn't know how those things went.
So I would like to get your history of the FBI raid. Before we leave the media thing, a couple questions. Did you you said you had cultivated initially relationships with a newspaper reporter. Was this something that you initiated, or how did this come about?
It was something that sort of gradually occurred over time, because the interviewer was Janet Day of the Rocky Mountain News, and she would be the person who was assigned to the Rocky Flats issues. She was very active in her writings at that time, and what was interesting about that relationship is that she would interview me and have a much deeper interest in the technical issues that EPA would be facing, and she had a way of trying to work out problem solving rather than just getting a story. She was much more interested, as you are, into what are the historical aspects here? What does it mean for society? What's all going on? And it was almost like somebody independent that I could soundboard with, and do problem solving, and just get a sense of, are we going in the right direction? What is the public concern here? help me understand it, Janet, because I want to be a good civil servant. I want to deliver for the public I'm charged to protect and the environment that I'm charged to protect. But sometimes I don't have any way to gauge how well we're doing unless I can use you as a sounding board. And she was very willing to do that kind of thing. And so I felt that I wanted to keep her as a positive professional relationship, and so I would try to keep her as informed as possible as to what we were doing with permitting of incinerators, for example, when the public comment period was happening. And she would keep me informed of the kinds of information she was discovering with the community, what they did know, what they didn't know. How come that communication wasn't occurring? How could we get them access to information? How could we do a better job of getting the questions answered? It was really a great exercise on answering some very difficult and complex questions that shouldn't have been that difficult to answer. The information should have been at our fingertips, and usually was. We just didn't know who to talk to all the time. And I found that she was a great help in making that information available.
Whose failure was that the information that, I guess to link up that Governor Romer didn't know about the raid, and that you weren't able to get information you needed, and that the community was in the dark about things that they should have known about?
I think it goes back to what we talked about before. There were so many layers of conflicting requirements and regulations, and then this whole environment of secrecy under the Cold War, where you do not have that aspect of being able to stand back and examine, and I think it was just simply the times. I don't mean to be trite, but it was the times we were living in, and people living under perhaps false ideology, or not even false ideology, but very strongly held ideology. Not to place judgment on it or anything like that, a very strongly held ideology. And learning that lesson that once you're in that mindset or that rut, it's very hard to move out of it and look at things from a creative or a more holistic or more enlightened perspective.
You're talking mainly about people at the plant the culture of secrecy, is that
the culture of secrecy at the plant, information just not coming and flowing freely out of that plant. Very officious processes that are required to declassify a simple document. And when it's declassified, all the relevant information that's important is redacted. So how does that help us? So you have these tremendously intense processes that have to be confronted and barriers that have to be overcome. It's not just like a normal conversation like we're having here, where you can get as much information out, you can brainstorm, and then call out the gems and make those the messages. It just took a lot of effort. It would take months to get information, or a decision on whether information could be released, and then another 2 weeks to figure out how do you convey that information. Just a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of effort. And that prevented information flowing to those who had an intense need. No. Then there were legal issues, liability issues. People wanted to sue. People wanted to recover money from the government, and the government didn't necessarily want to enable their lawsuits unnecessarily.
People whose health had suffered that kind of thing?
Either people whose health had suffered, or people who made claims that their health had suffered. Perhaps those were valid claims, perhaps they were not. But once the legal process in this country moves forward, and the discovery process is a very controlled process, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Some people would say that's appropriate, and others would say that harmed people.
So, and you had described having this media contact as your safety valve, or as a safety valve. In what way did you see it as a safety valve?
I felt that having a media contact person, knowing the history and what was going on, was a safety valve, because there was someone else who knew. There was just another person who had information. I wasn't the only one holding this information. It wasn't just sitting in a file in EPA's regional office after I wrote the inspection report. It was getting out to this other individual. And that individual, because of the nature of their work, would sift through it and easily and immediately communicated to the public, so that there was at least some knowledge and accountability, other than through just my chain of command. It just made things a little bit more trusting and accountable.
And all this information was obviously information that was available to the public.
Yes.
Just the public had to find it.
Right. And as the process moved forward, as EPA gained more presence at the site, as the state health department gained more presence at the site, more information came to light, more processes came into being. Public comment, something as simple as public comment periods under permits for storage areas, treatment areas of waste materials. This is something that the Department of Energy and Rocky Flats was never exposed to before. They were always able to do everything that they had to do to meet their mission internally, in isolation from the community, from the public, from other political entities such as the governor's office and the state health department. Well, that was no longer the case. And as a result of them being subject to other regulations, they were also subject to public scrutiny. And the more the public learned, the more the public demanded more. So the next evolution of the public awareness and involvement process was, well, we don't want to just have a 30-day comment period where you get our comments and then you decide what to do. We want a stakeholder process where we get advance notice of comments, of public activities coming up, so we can be better prepared. We can ask more intelligent questions. We can probe more. We can do for ourselves. We don't want to necessarily rely on the Environmental Protection Agency. We don't want to necessarily rely on the state. We want to be self-reliant. We're glad they're there, but they don't always know. My goodness, we, the citizens and the protesters, discovered this incident and the state and EPA never even knew about it. They wanted to have that access. They wanted to be self-initiating. And as that process started to open up, it became more formalized, it became more structured, and it became more commonplace. So there was a real radical change in the way business was done.
And one more thing before we get to the FBI stuff. You mentioned that you had to renegotiate these cleanup agreements every couple of years, and that at each time there was jurisdictional disputes. Why were they changed all the time?
The cleanup agreements had to change because they would get updated. When you do cleanup at a hazardous waste site or a Superfund site, you don't have all the information at hand. And as you go forward, there's an assessment process. You do a lot of studies. You have to find the extent of contamination. And as that information becomes available, you change the schedules for when things need to be completed by. You change the scope of the project. And so the cleanup agreements became outdated or irrelevant once more environmental information was learned. Once the historical aerial photographs of the sites became analyzed and were validated, the scope of the problem grew beyond what we thought would be there. And then the progress starts to get made. Sites start to close down. You finish a cleanup and you get to look at what's left and reprioritize what you're going to do first, how much money you're going to spend, and what budgets have to be appropriated to do it. And the cleanup agreements were the vehicles for informing Congress, informing the agencies on what that task would entail. And so they would have to be updated as the new information came along. And sometimes new laws happen. The Superfund law was updated. The Resource Conservation Recovery Act law was reauthorized and updated. New provisions were brought in, and so those had to be considered and factored into and integrated into the cleanup. So that was part of one of the reasons cleanup agreements changed.
Okay. So FBI raid. If you want to tell me sort of your involvement with it and the history of it.
My first impression with the FBI, my first experience with the FBI raid was when I was sitting in my little cubicle, I think on the 6th floor of this building, and this very stereotypical individual, John Lipsky was his name, came to visit me at my cube. And he was dressed just like one of the Blues Brothers. He had a black suit, a black tie, a white shirt, white socks, and shined black shoes. And I almost laughed at the image that was before me because of the stereotypical nature of him. In very short order, because of his seriousness in his training and his dedication, he made it very clear to me that this was a serious matter. I really almost thought it was a joke. I could not believe that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actually saying, we have concerns that there's a failure of environmental compliance at a national security weapons manufacturing plant. I thought it was too surreal. I didn't think it possible because I felt like that was just too much of a leap to make, that they would actually be interested in this. It was too small an issue. It just was incongruent with what I thought politically was politically correct at that time. He was very serious, as was Bill Smith, who was the EPA criminal investigator from our National Enforcement Investigation Center in Boulder. They were both incredibly serious guys. They were very thorough in their questioning. I felt like I was being interrogated. At one point, John actually made me feel like my actions were questioned, that I hadn't been tough enough, that I wasn't pushing hard enough. And in fact, the reality was, he was probably right. What we had talked about before, that there was an atmosphere of cooperation amongst federal agencies. These individuals made me question that, even more so than my own legal advisors in the agency. And it became so serious that a process called parallel proceedings had to be invoked, where I, being on the civil side of a law issue, and they being on the criminal side of the law issue, they had to proceed in parallel procedures, and they couldn't cross-communicate except under very extenuating circumstances, when one part of the investigation absolutely needed to hear what another side of the investigation had to say. And so it was a great education for me on criminal proceedings. And the investigation was an incredibly serious thing. It's a very difficult thing for me too, because I remember distinctly feeling squeezed, because I was the liaison with the workers at the plant and working with them to hopefully improve and approve their efforts to ramp up their environmental programs. There's a very poignant moment out of the site in summer before the raid, and one of my contacts, we were out in the field, nobody was writing anything down, just looked at me and said, we found a water monitor in the stream. It's a pretty sophisticated piece of equipment, so we don't think it's one of the protesters. Did you put it there? They just flatly asked me, did you put it there? And I had knowledge of the criminal investigation. And I was put in a spot where I had no training. I had no idea what to say to that. I had not been prompted or informed of the fact that our criminal investigators were monitoring the water coming off of the plant prior to developing the case. And here I was confronted with the question of, is it a monitor? And by the way, Nat, whoever's it is, if they're checking up on us, we're confident that we're meeting the requirements. We're just hurt that we weren't informed, because I thought we were working together to improve the situation. And all I could say was, I know that is not an EPA Virginia monitor. I can't tell you whose it is because I really don't know. Well, actually, I did know whose it was, but because I was being, I guess, questioned and being used as a source of information with the criminal involvement group, I just didn't feel comfortable in revealing what they were doing. but it was pretty much a no-brainer. The people at the plant were very intelligent people. They knew that in Lakewood, just down the street from them, EPA had a criminal investigation center, and that it was likely that our laboratories were doing testing. And so it was a very, very poignant moment that I remember in the development of the criminal case. At that time, I did not know whether there would be what they called the raid, and I didn't know if that would go anywhere. I was just really hoping that all the data would come together and would inform us on what we needed to do to either prevent future contamination or clean up contamination.
So when were you informed of that it was going to be a raid?
I never was, so I never knew that they would go in. My most telling involvement with that was a day when I was asked to come to the Department of Justice's regional director's office while they were considering their next steps. And the prosecutor, I don't know what they call them, it's not prosecutor, district attorney, I guess.
U.S. attorney?
U.S. attorney.
It was federal, right?
Federal regional U.S. attorney.
Yeah, probably
Mike
U.S.
Martin,
attorney.
who was a Republican political appointee, was in a room with all his advisors and his assistant attorneys and the FBI investigators and the NEIC criminal investigators, and they were discussing what their next steps ought to be. And I got this, I was not told what was going on, but I got the sense there was an important decision that had to be made. And I was in the room because much of the information that they were basing their affidavits on for warrants was based on my reports. So he just turned to me once and he just said, "Do you think that they're involved in criminal negligence at the site?" And I thought, wow, here's the U.S. attorney asking me this question. And my answer was, you know what? The answer to that question is, I don't know. And then I said, and that's the problem. I should know, and so should the community. There should be no mystery about the contamination, to what extent the environment's been impacted, and to what extent human health has been affected. After 3 or 4 years of working at that site, which is where I was about in this process, I should absolutely know everything. And with the security clearance, I do not, and I think that's the problem. And shortly thereafter that, I was informed that the plant had a visit from a very large contingent of the FBI and EPA's criminal investigators.
Do you think that they did it diplomatically the way they should have?
I think that they did it the way they did it, the way they decided to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of things that go into that decision and how they go forward. A lot of it is because they need to have the element of surprise. They don't want the plant being in a situation where they're actually cleaning up some of the violations that they might find ahead of the investigation. Now, ultimately, that's the whole reason for the whole thing, is to improve the practices. Right. But at that time, I think that they were probably more secretive than they probably needed to be, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a decision for them to make. They're the experts. They're the people who do that all the time.
So do you think the visit was warranted?
Wow, that's the $18 million question, isn't it? Wasn't that the penalty that was settled on? So one would think that if there was a penalty of $18 million, that it was warranted, just in economic measures. The attention that was paid to the nuclear weapons complex across the country, not just at Rocky Flats, was ramped up in speed and process tremendously. So, I guess there's an old adage that says the squeaky wheel against the grease. From that point forward, there was a lot of attention paid to compliance throughout the Department of Energy complex. Not only the Department of Energy, but the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. Immediate attention paid to coming into compliance with the law and not messing around or dilly-dallying or bringing issues such as jurisdiction to light or lack of resources. Congress's attention was focused on it, appropriations were made, and a change happened. And so I guess my answer would be is that it was appropriate action taken, and that as a result, things changed.
Did they find what they thought they were going to find?
I don't think so. And I'm not really sure how much I can talk about this. There was a whole investigation, and there was a grand jury on the matter, and that grand jury can't even talk about what it was that they heard during the grand jury proceedings. I do not believe that they found everything that they thought they would find that was on the affidavit in the search warrant. I believe they found many other things that they did not expect to find. I think that there was a much bigger focus on contamination of the strictures, the wastewater treatment plant.
Initially, or after
the fact.
what they found?
I think they found a lot more concern about contaminants entering the creeks and being spray irrigated and just being released from the ponds and the wastewater treatment plants than they had focused on initially. I know that their initial focus was a lot about illegally burning hazardous waste, and I didn't think that panned out very much. But again, that's something that the grand jury had to deal with, and I have no insights into those proceedings.
This is sort of backtracking quite a bit, but in your inspections, what were the most troubling things you found?
Most of what I found were violations of storage requirements, things that were on site much longer than were allowed to be on site. The premise behind that is that if things are left around, containers deteriorate, hazardous releases occur. So, letter of the law kinds of violations and problems, not necessarily huge environmental problems, but the biggest real environmental problems were the surface impoundments reaching into groundwater, potentially getting into surface streams that would come off-site. And then the other problems were solid wastes not being adequately stabilized or inspected or managed appropriately before they were disposed of off-site. That made them relatively able to deteriorate and release to the environment. And so not enough precautions taken to make sure that the liquid and sludge wastes were solidified and treated appropriately. The pondcrete, the wastecrete issue was the biggest issue I think I really ever got into. The other issue that I got into was just using thermal treatment and hazardous waste incineration for things like radioactive materials. Technology just wasn't all that great. And here were what I was told, and I came to actually reasonably believe was true, some of the best minds and highest trained technical people in the world working on this issue, and they still had no solutions for what to do with the radioactive portions of the mixed wastes. And incinerating this stuff in volatile combustion technology where emissions could be sent into the atmosphere was risky business, and it was relatively safe, but it still had not the level of assurances that I would have felt comfortable with. That didn't mean we had to stop everything. It meant that we still had to do the research. We had to spend more time on being careful and communicating the results, and then finding the technology we needed so that we could use it now as part of our weaning ourselves from foreign energy resources. So had we been able to go forward and really focus on it, we would have much better technology today. That was one of my biggest concerns, is that the technology just wasn't as good as it was being talked up as being.
And they were burning, and that was what the raid was about initially.
Initially, they were doing a lot of testing.
Yeah. Okay.
I think what was discovered during the raid was that what was thought to have been incinerated in large amounts was not that big an amount. There was actually violations of permit requirements. Those were valid. It's just that the amount was very small amounts, very contained, very structured processes. The real concern was that somehow during some operation, the fluidized bed incinerator was burning stuff that they didn't have permits for, they hadn't gone through the public process of hearing for. I'm not sure that panned out. Some of it may have, but I don't think it ended up being on the scale that was originally thought was going on as a result of some of the infrared flyovers, some misunderstanding of the design of the buildings or building systems.
But either way, they stopped burning after the raid in general because
they found different processes to use, and of course then the production stopped, so the waste streams were no longer produced. The problem was solved by the cold war.
Yes. What were your relations with, you discussed this a little bit with the practical jokes and that sort of thing, but did you feel you had good relations with the people in the plant and then also the community activists and the protesters on the outside?
I believe I did. I believe that I had as good a relationship with the multi-stakeholders as anyone did at that time. It was really a challenge too. It was a challenge to be an overseer of the contractors in the Department of Energy and watching not only how well they complied, but also being knowledgeable about how much money they spent on that and how much it was costing, and overseeing their budgets. And really, the word is oversight and verification, but it really is, it's really second guessing whether they're getting good use of taxpayers' money and complying with the law in a timely fashion. That's a very difficult role to play and still have a good working relationship. I believe that I had that. I believe I had achieved that desirable balance between being respected and trying to be seen as someone who's also helpful, part of the solution and not part of the problem. And it's one thing to always say there's something wrong, there's something wrong, there's something wrong. It's a whole nother thing to sit down and roll your sleeves up and say, well, let's fix this. Let's get to a place where we all can agree that things are better and they're improved and that we're doing it the right way. And that's what I tried to do. So with the plant and the facilities and the people, I find I was doing quite well. With the communities, the citizens, I thought I was doing okay. I felt like I could do much better, but it was always that issue of me not having the information myself, me not being able to answer for them in a very succinct way, in a very well-researched risk communication manner, that they were in no danger, that their health wasn't affected, and that wasn't adversely affected, and that they were fortunate that people at the plant were so conscientious, and they were lucky that something of more cataclysmic nature than the 69 fires and the other fires and the releases didn't occur, because it could have, really could have. That was in part because of the diligence of the people at the plant, but also just very lucky. Good planning, large buffer zone, and an unfortunate encroachment of the growth of the Denver metro area closer to the plant, making that a much more serious concern.
Of course, many of the houses were built for the workers, right?
Yeah, the workers and the support industries that came as a result of that, and just the growing economy in Denver. Information technology, innovation, people wanting to live here. It's a great place to be.
And in terms of the people at the plant, was there, you did again mention the goo and Building 801 and all that stuff. Was that a good-natured practical jokes, or was there some initial resentment, and did you have to work through that?
It was a little of both. It was mostly good-natured joking. I think that there was actually that kind of humor culture at Rocky Flats, and for the most part I thought it was harmless, and it actually helped build relationships in many ways. It sort of was a good-natured aspect. Now, someone who's very stressed, very concerned, a family member whose family member had been exposed or was sick or became ill because of exposures, that's not appreciated, and it's a very serious manner. But it is also human nature. You'll find that in any kind of setting that you might be exposed to, and so one would probably expect to run into that anywhere under a very difficult scenario.
So, how did you moving past the FBI raid? What happened? How did you end up? You're in a different job now, I assume.
Yeah, I'm in a different job. I stayed with the Rocky Flats project long after the investigation. It was a very intense period. The Tiger teams were launched. An admiral was assigned.
Were there Tiger teams?
Tiger teams was the Department of Energy's response to the criminal investigation. At the same time that the FBI and EPA were investigating the plant, the Department of Energy said, "Oh my goodness, this is serious business. We need to get our own people looking into what went wrong and how to fix it." And so they launched what was called a Tiger team investigative arm, and I think that's pretty common in the Department of Defense and Department of Energy.
Mm-hmm.
A retired admiral was given charge of that Tiger team. Some of their best talents came in and evaluated right alongside the FBI and EPA investigation team what was going on. So it was a very intense activity, a flurry of activity. Then things sort of settled down. The case started to get processed, and it took a couple of years. During that time, I was still working with the plant and the state of Colorado to put processes in place, and the criminal investigation and the case moving forward hindered that in a way because there were things we could talk about. People were a lot more skittish about saying what they had to say. There was processes that had to come in to reassure people that they were not personally liable, but I don't think that liability ever really went away.
Mm-hmm.
There were all kinds of questions that were left up in the air up until the point that the case was settled a couple of years later. I then moved on from the project and became a supervisor in the hazardous waste program. I changed jobs and worked in the watershed community-based environmental protection program where we worked with communities to tackle and address their environmental problems in multimedia settings. Now I work as EPA's revitalization coordinator, working with communities to clean up properties and turn them to reuse, which is ironic because that's the issue that's being discussed for Rocky Flats right now. Now that it's being turned over to a national wildlife refuge, is it cleaned up appropriately to the level to support that? Will there be redevelopment of the properties nearby? The answer is yes, there will be. There will be highly valued properties, and growth will occur at an exponential rate now that the cleanup is being announced. Is today Wednesday? Today is Wednesday. Thursday, there is a federal agency celebration of the construction completion.
Oh, that's right. The big ball or something,
The big ball
right?
or something.
Yeah.
I wasn't invited.
Neither was anybody at the museum. They're mad.
I have nothing to wear. So I'm not going. But
who did they invite?
It's a milestone. It's a very significant milestone, and it makes me feel very good that it's happening. I had several calls from people asking me, "How did I feel? Is it a whitewash job? Are they not cleaning up enough?" And I said, "No, actually, I absolutely feel that a really good job has been done, and that it's a fantastic future use for that property, the wildlife refuge, and that it's very important to have the money set aside forever to be able to monitor what's going on there and see what happens, and to have long-term institutional controls so that the environmental stewardship remains at a high level there. And it's really good that we move on and show that we can tackle these problems, and maybe in the future do them faster and even better, so that there's closure at Rocky Flats, closure for the community, closure for the people, and some hope for the next generation that something good is going to come from the land reuse of that effort, so that the Cold War role of that plant can act as an example that it's not the only thing that can happen there, that it was not the only thing that had to happen there, and that time does move on, we learn and we grow. I think it's really a really wonderful thing that'll happen. I'm looking forward to being a very old man and walking with my cane into the museum, for example, and looking at the history or walking on the trails of the site and viewing the wildlife and bird life, and knowing that that little property is now preserved in a lot of ways because the people who created the site had the foresight to create the buffer area. Now, one of the biggest, I don't know if it's a myth, but legends, is that the plant was sited totally incorrectly because of inaccurately reading windrows data, that it was sited upstream of Denver metro area. But people may not understand that perhaps people wanting to live in Boulder, who were the scientists that did the analysis, said, oh yeah, it's okay to locate it there because it's a downwind Boulder, Colorado. So, very interesting little legends and myths that I think would be great stories to explore through the museum as is.
But you don't think it was improperly cited?
Actually, I do. I don't think that it should have been cited in that area, but I think that it was a very hard thing to decide at the time in the 50s. Denver was a cow town. It wasn't some kind of thing that people saw as being a thriving, growing metropolis in the future. But hindsight, again, is 2020, and the city just grew intensively. Now, actually, more scientifically, if one were to pay more attention to the potential threats of handling nuclear materials, and if one had a huge history of industrial accidents, it's probably not a great place to site the facility because it still was upwind a city.
Yeah.
That's just not common sense. So there probably was a better place to look to do that.
So it sounds like you had a lot of experience and have subsequently had a lot of experience with groundwater stuff. Some of the workers I've spoken with are concerned that it isn't being, and of course the activists are concerned that it isn't being cleaned up below that 3-foot level. From your experience and what you learned about the groundwater issues there, is that a mistake?
Well, I think it's protective for the land use that has been designated there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a pristine removal of contaminants. Groundwater is an incredibly valuable resource in the West. And if there's anything more that can be done in treatment systems in the future, should it become economically feasible, we should look into that and pursue it vigorously. But if there's institutional controls on how the groundwater is used or not to be used, I think it's an appropriate remedy. And I think we, again, have to move forward. We can't just study it, and we can't spend billions and billions of dollars that we don't have to continue it. Now, those are extremes on the spectrum, billions and billions of dollars, or doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there more that could be done? There probably is a little bit more, and maybe the community, the workers aren't satisfied at this point. Being an environmentalist, always hoping that I will be an environmentalist all my life, I think that probably more could be done. It's not me who makes those decisions. It's a collective group of the EPA, the Department of Energy, the stakeholders who are involved, people who have to figure in cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we are. I think it's an incredibly good designation in land use. Protection of that groundwater will be assured for the future. Should it be treated and cleaned up to a higher level? I don't know. Is that groundwater ever going to be used as a resource for somebody's drinking water? The institutional controls and the long-term stewardship of that site are going to have to be sustained. That's going to take an investment to assure that anything that may still be contaminated is not passed on or doesn't move through the uptake chain of human ingestment or environmental liability. That's a very tough question. Are future generations going to be able to be aware of that need? And are they going to sustain that cost? I hope so. I hope the museum can help make sure they're educated on that. I hope other institutional controls help that. And I think it's very important in the future. One thing the Cold War era taught us is that we're going to live with it for a long time. It's going to have lessons to teach us, but there are impacts that all of the decisions involved with that era are things we are going to be living with for quite a long time. And I hope we never forget. We're never going to forget the Holocaust in World War II. We're never going to forget the Cold War. And I hope we continue to learn and evolve and do better in this time.
So when you learned that the plant was going to be closed, what was your reaction? What did you think about it?
Oh, I don't know how to describe that reaction. I think it was a reaction of great satisfaction. It was a reaction, a sense of closure. Sooner than I thought I would get a sense of closure, which really made me proud. Proud of the people who were responsible for the cleanup, the contractors working on it, and proud of the people at EPA who followed me on that project. They got it done sooner and under budget. And I think that is something for everyone to be very proud of. And I think that it's important to do that. We need to learn how to do these things better, cheaper, and faster so we can do it a lot more. And a lot of different places, there are a lot of places that need cleaning up in this world.
Yeah. I guess we're moving to the wrap-up questions now. We've got about 15 minutes left on the tape. So I guess I have this question here. Did your official role at Rocky Flats ever conflict with your personal feelings about the place?
Yeah. Let me just check.
And then
something.
how did those feelings change, too? It's sort of about the nuclear industry. You can wrap a bunch into one question.
Yeah. I think that the most interesting answer to that question for myself is that my personal value system at the time that I was involved on Rocky Flats was not consistent with the mission of the plant, which is kind of an interesting thing. And my responsibility as a representative of a federal agency also was not consistent with my own personal values around nuclear proliferation, which was the mission of that plant. And so I was always walking a tightrope between wanting to use my position at the agency to help communicate one of the consequences of the Cold War and nuclear proliferation in a way that was consistent with my responsibilities as someone who was in the business of cleaning up the environment. It's a very, very difficult role to be in. Like I said, walking a fine line all the time, not being allowed to cross over, and not being allowed to express my personal value systems as a representative of the federal government. And there are a lot of people who will point to those newspaper articles and the interviews that I did and say I crossed that line and it was inappropriate. And I'm not sad that I did, because I felt, for the reasons we discussed before, that people just needed to know, others needed to know than myself, and that the debate had to happen, and that we really needed to understand that there were consequences to this decision of nuclear proliferation and not Daytona, but nuclear deterrence. Mm-hmm. It really was an important debate that needed to happen, and the environmental consequences was one element of that debate that was emerging while I was involved in it, and I thought it was very important. So, yeah, there was a lot of conflict between my personal values and beliefs and what I was allowed to, appropriately so, represent as a representative of the agency. It's very clear that was a very important concern.
Did your involvement with the plant change your personal feelings at all?
My involvement with the plant did change my personal feelings. It changed my reality meter. The question I found myself asking, and I'm not sure everyone else would ask this question, was, could I have done better? If I were a contractor to the Department of Energy, could I have done a better job? Would I have done a better job? I would like to think so. But putting myself in their shoes, understanding the constraints they were working with, the priorities that they had, the financial limitations that they had, the mission that they had signed up for, and their passion to do a good job, I think that my personal perspective changed a lot. I came to respect a lot of those people tremendously for their commitment. There were things that I thought were stupid, things that I got angry at when I saw them. No. The greed aspect of our defense infrastructure is still prevalent to this day, and it's a lot of money that gets pumped into these things that we do, like nuclear proliferation or homeland security or anything else, it's very difficult not to come across corruption. And when you do, it's a saddening thing. So my resolve to be strong and have integrity and be principled around those issues, I think, was increased. But my empathy for the people at the site and the job they were trying to do also increased.
Did you feel that you came across corruption?
I think that there was overcharging. I think that being able to find, for example, I just came back from EPA's response on Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, and the labor wage and the skill level of labor there. These people are working tremendously hard and they're getting an awful lot done. But the wage that they're getting paid is nothing compared to someone in a high-level nuclear weapons plant. But it's some of the same type of work. And you can find that discrepancy and disparity no matter where you go when you're comparing apples and oranges, they say. But I find that there can be a tendency for overcharging. And I felt like in reviewing some of the contractor work that there was some of that going on, because I could turn to another contractor in a different field and find the same work for a lesser cost. I was also reminded that my analysis was invalid sometimes because there were requirements that they had to meet, such as security requirements that would take longer to get the job done, to be able to get just a clear security clearance in the plant, or to get a special equipment piece. Sometimes that was true, sometimes that was not. And I think that that's inherent in a big project like that where there are large dollars. It's very difficult to have that accountability piece precise. But it's very important to look at it all the time.
So I guess pretty much done with these questions. Have the question about what the best, worst, or most interesting things with your involvement were. And then if there's anything else that we haven't covered.
But I think there were a couple. The most interesting thing was learning the science of radioactive materials and radionuclides. I had not been highly trained in that in my school experience, although I did study with one of the guys who worked in the Manhattan Project at my school. He was the instructor for physics and nuclear physics at the Merchant Marine School in New York. And it was a very interesting, almost ironic full circle, having studied with Dr. Degani, who was in the Manhattan Project, and then ending up in this situation. I was not the most knowledgeable person about radioactive materials, nuclear weapons proliferation, or manufacturing, or industrial aspects. I found that incredibly interesting. The health and safety standards, the international and national health and safety standards, was a science that I found incredibly fascinating and just so lengthy and a great study. And I had to be up on that to be proficient and be able to communicate with the community. The worst part is exactly the same, is that seeing the lack of science that existed. And sometimes some of the most crudest processes were used to handle these materials. And the example that I give is everything that was shipped off-site had to go through this radio, this X-ray scoping, and it was incredibly high-tech. They could tell little vials of liquid moving around in these drums. And yet, some of the ways they collected that material were very crude. Janitors going in without gloves, picking stuff up and throwing it in the drum. Well, we were entering the era of robotics and things. If they could have glove boxes and robotics that created these materials, why couldn't they have the same thing for managing the waste? And so the interesting thing was that. The other most interesting thing that I experienced was the top rope ride, watching that process, but mostly having my dad's sister, my aunt in New York State, call me up and say, "Hey, I saw you on television. My, you're a handsome man." That's probably the one thing that I'll never forget, having my aunt call me and say, I saw you on TV, it was great.
So just sort of being at the center of this really interesting.
Being at the center of it and just having personal touches. For me, it was all about the people and the personal touches. Getting awards from some of the actual protesters. Being a federal person, pointy-headed bureaucrat, and actually getting recognition from these people who were putting their own money and time on the line to do what they were doing. And just, whether they were right or wrong, whether you like their methods or not, just being so dedicated and never giving up. That kind of human involvement and that kind of personal lesson. It's inspiring. And I'm very appreciative of being able to meet those people.
Well, anything else that we
No.
haven't covered?
No.
Got it? Okay, well, this was great, really interesting. Thank you. Let me just make sure I guess the one question that I didn't ask you is how would you assess the effectiveness of your work?
I think the effectiveness of our work was very high in the area of shifting awareness and going someplace where environmental regulations and environmental considerations were not a priority and changing that around. I don't think our effectiveness was great in doing it in a cost-effective way and doing it quickly. I think we've learned a lot of lessons so that we can do that much better now. We have a lot of history behind us, a lot of research behind us, so that cleaning up difficult sites is a little bit more routine than it was back then, and both in dollar expenditure and time expenditure, we could have been much more effective, and today we will be.
And were you had left the job already when they announced the production was ceasing?
I was transitioning out, so I was still there.
So so you weren't part of the cleanup plans that were formulated in the move to decommissioning the
Right. I
plant.
think when I left, they actually were given the mission. Before I left, they were given the mission of decommissioning. But at that time that they got that decision, there wasn't a lot of trust that the Soviet Union threat was really gone. And so there was an awful lot of, posturing that said, if we need to, we can go right back into production. So a lot of the production lines still was maintained.
Okay.
So there was that transition period. It hadn't been totally decided we're shutting it down. The mission statement was changed then.
Okay. And one final question. You were there for Rockwell and EG&G.
Yes.
What was it like working with those two different contractors, and were they very different?
It was pretty much the same.
Okay.
EG&G actually had more of a conscientious perspective because they were required to. And but if you really looked at it, the people I worked with were pretty much the same. A lot of the Rockwell employees were hired by EG&G because they wanted to stay in the area.
Right.
And they quit their jobs and competed for the contract under EG&G. I was actually grateful for that because that allowed continuity from the people who knew what was going on. Also allowed new blood to come in, new management and new focus. So you had the best of both worlds. You had the continuity and you had the fresh thinking, new ideas, new brains, new emphasis. So to me, only good things could happen out of that. There was some confusion. There was still some complaints that it wasn't being done fast enough, well enough, that the contractors somehow were charging far too much. All of those complaints and concerns were legitimate in some cases and non-legitimate in others. But I was very grateful that I could work with some of the same people that I had known in the plant who knew what was going on, didn't have a ramp-up period, as well as new people who said, yeah, this is a priority and we're serious about it. So that may sound a little Pollyannish, but I think it was true.
Okay.
Oh, and I have a couple of things I want you to see as far as memory.
Okay.
This was given to me, and I cherish it, but I think it's good to have it in the museum. It's an award I was given by the protesters.
Why don't you hold it up so I can... That's radical. That's great. Okay.
And I think it has one of their information printouts on it, and some of the efforts that they had initiated to do communication with the people living around the land. And of course, a lot of people will say that it's exaggerated and it's some Chicken Little, the sky is falling, but these kinds of things don't happen unless there's a void in communication and a lack of information. So that was a kind of fun thing. Hadn't already done it. Jim Morris, the artist who drew a lot of the posters and a lot of the T-shirts for Rocky Flats.
Was it cool? We can stop Rocky Flats. Jim Morris is his name?
Yeah, I think that his name is on here. Yeah, Jim Morris, Boulder. He's in Boulder, Colorado, or he was. All the contacts that you needed to make to try to get the plant to be shut down.
Cool. Okay.
On there.
Well, no,
was
it was really
catharsis.
interesting. It was a really interesting article. I mean, interview. It's good. As you said, the sort of idea. I was thinking as I'm thinking about writing something about it, that part of what I'm seeing is that people just saw their little slice of it, and it was neat to know what they knew, what was in front of them seemed fine or seemed terrible or.
It's such a statement on our society too.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't really want to, and we're very glad to be compartmentalized.
Yeah.
It's, the whole idea of multi-jurisdictional collaboration, multidisciplinary scientific entities getting together and sharing notes so you can have those aha moments. We're supposed to be all about that, but more and more we protect our turf, try to get into specialization, isolate ourselves from things. And it's just so hard for the mind to embrace sometimes. But in this case, not just at Rocky Flats, but the whole DOE complex, it really showed the vulnerability. Tremendous advances, but really a real vulnerability when it comes to what the impact was environmentally and human health-wise. Well, I hope you get back okay.
I'm sure it'll be
Not as
better.
freezing as Rocky.